Now you can hear him. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Rabbi zidna ilma wa la tuzigh qulubana ba'da idh hadaytana wa hab lana min ladunka rahmah innaka antal wahhab. Ya Allah, please increase us in knowledge and don't allow our hearts to deviate away from truth and guidance after you have shown them to us. Allahumma aftah masami'a qulubina li dhikrik. Ya Allah, please open the hearing channels of our hearts to your dhikr. As we continue, my dear brothers and sisters, journeying through this episode of learning about the value of our sacred Islamic knowledge, learning about the value of scholarship and ijtihad in scholarship, learning about diversity in the opinions of scholarship that are born out of essential norms and regulations within the language and the law itself. Within all of that, a unity required for us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as is diversity in unity of His creation subhanahu wa ta'ala. And remember, as we continue to speak now of the specifics, remember not to forget the picture we have first started with and introduced all this talk about, inshallah ta'ala. And of course, some of what we're covering here, though in a way is simple but not necessarily easy to grasp and to internalize and to know all the time. Yet with those of us, for example, who are not attending here or not listening to this, and if we don't have some exposure of this knowledge and we understand it, then we're going to always be instruments of discord and disunity. Because when we ask questions and we want details and we want this and we want that and we agree with this and we disagree with that, and yet we do not make efforts to learn the logic of the deen, the rationale of the deen, the logic of scholarship, the rationale of scholarship. Add to that, most importantly, the spiritual dimensions. When we don't do that, then we are going to continue to be instruments, either actually or potentially instruments for discord and disunity. Otherwise, if we don't know these things and we don't appreciate them, the best thing to do to be safe with Allah Azza wa Jal and to not be hurtful to society is to keep politely quiet, inshallah ta'ala. So, I was discussing with you earlier the two types of hukum wada'i and hukum taklifi. Those are the two types of al-ahkam al-shar'iyya that exist. Wada'i and taklifi. There is no third one. And we're learning about not only the definitions of those ahkam, but as we're learning about those definitions, I hope you're sensing with me, as we were explaining, we're learning certain logical things about them, certain practical things about them, certain also underlying attributes that are linked to differences amongst the scholars, respectable differences amongst the scholars. As you keep looking at that, we're going to do more of that, and we're going to see more of that, inshallah ta'ala. The next thing we said, the concept of al-amr and al-nahi. And what is al-nahi? Now we're learning, mashallah. Nobody said nahi is a prohibition. You answered well now, you're careful. Nahi does not necessarily mean prohibition. Amr, what does amr mean? Positive command, which does not mean necessarily you must do, by the way. But that's what most understand, even intelligent people who are not familiar with the technical juristic discourse of our ulama. And that's simple, but very important and profound. And I start with the amr. Al-amr is a positive, imperative command about do something. When we hear a command, do something, usually most people, or a lot of people understand that it is obligatory to do that, correct? When you say, Amar Allahu, Allah gave an amr, commanded. Most people understand. Or Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam command. It's a command from Rasulullah. I bet you if before I introduce to this thing, if I ask a show of hands, everybody almost will raise their hand and say, of course we must, because it's a command. And the answer, surprisingly, in our Shara', in language, is not true. Al-Amr, an imperative positive command, implies many meanings. As a matter of fact, the ulama have talked about something like, probably in the case of Amr, at least a dozen of possible implications of the positive command, of the Amr, of which is obligation. Of which is obligation. Add to that 12 or 13 or 20 of those. Every time you hear a command, it doesn't mean obligation. And how did we define obligation in fiqh? In Usool al-Fiqh, actually. How was it? I'm going to pick now. Everybody should know. How did we define wajib? Next, how did we define wajib? That's not enough. You looked at it. That's the right answer. Again, wajib is, if we do it, we're rewarded. If we don't do it, we're punished. That's what we mean by wajib, obligatory. Amr, imperative positive command, does not only imply obligation, wujub. It implies many things. Of those many things, the ulama have argued and differed. Of those many meanings, such as al-irshad, such as al-istihbab, such as al-ibaha, such as al-du'a, and so on, all of those, are they intended haqiqatan or majazan? Another discourse. Another beautiful discourse. They agreed at least that three are intended when we say wujub, when we say obligation. Three implications, three meanings are intended in the literal sense. Any one of them could be that one. Three, not one. Okay? And the rest of the 17th also, they agreed they are majazan. They are intended not directly in the literal sense, in the haqiqah sense, but in the metaphorical sense. Such as dua, such as command, imply the meaning of prayerfulness. Such as dua, such as command implies the meaning of advice. When I tell you, write it this way. This is a command, right? It's a command, but does it imply I'm telling you you must do that? I'm giving you an advice, actually, in the way you can best write it. So that means advice. It doesn't mean obligation. If I say, I raise my hands in dua and I say, Ya Allah, ighfirli. Ighfirli. What does ighfirli mean? It's a verb of command in the language. Fi'al amr. Ighfirli. Forgive me. Here, ighfirli doesn't imply command, because we all know that. Because it's a abd asking the creator. So I cannot oblige the creator. So here's an example of the verb of command implying dua or implying irshad, advice, and not implying obligation. And so it is in the language and the logic of the language. And the Quran is in the language created by Allah Azza wa Jal, in this case of the Arabs, and the Sunnah of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is in the Arabic language, and it has its logic. So that's the necessary knowledge of the logic of the language is crucial to the knowledge of the law, especially the nuances in the law, the differences in the law. So al-amr, they have agreed after having argued that some of it implies in reality and some of it is implied metaphorically. They agreed that three of them are implied, are within the scope of the actual real implication of obligation, of wujub. And they are, of the imperative command. And they are al-wujub, al-nadb, and al-ibaha. Al-wujub, obligation. Al-nadb, recommendation or istihbab. Al-ibaha, permission. In other words, you can hear a verb of command and it simply means permission. It doesn't mean obligation. It doesn't mean recommendation. It means even ibaha. And there are examples like that in the Quran and in the Sunnah. First of all, are you with me? Isn't this, to most of you here, isn't this new? It is new even to some people of ilm who have not carefully looked at these things. Or if we knew them, people know them, have memorized them at one point, how they are practiced and applied is completely out of memory and out of practice, totally. And they are simple truths, but very profound in consequences. So every time we hear a verb of command, in language in general, in the Quran or in the Sunnah, we say, this is a command from Allah. Alhamdulillah, we should revere any command of Allah Azza wa Jalla or His Rasul. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Revering the command of Allah or His Rasul is part of being a mu'min. It's part of being on the right track, to revere them. But does it imply obligation? And if I don't do it, you treat me as a kafir? Even that you shouldn't? Or as a mubtadi' or as kada or as a kada? That's a different issue. It's a different issue. A verb of command could imply any of those three. And then they have argued, rahimahullah ta'ala, the ulama, all on the basis of rational argument, logical argument. Because now it's these are texts, and texts have to be understood within the rationale of the language and the rationale of the logic of meanings and the words that are conveyed and the meanings that are conveyed by words. They have to understand that. And so they say, well, you see, in the presence of a command, of an imperative positive command, if there is no other qarina, now this is a new word I'm introducing, if there is no other qarina, it's a very important word in Usool ul-Fiqh. Qarina, you can translate it as circumstance, an associated circumstance with this legal verdict. If there is no other circumstance, textual circumstance or other circumstance that indicates that this imperative command does not, listen to my words carefully, does not imply obligation, I repeat, in the absence of a qarina, the absence of a circumstance, whether that circumstance is textual or otherwise, or logical, explicit textual or implicit in its meaning. If there is no such a qarina to tell us that this imperative command does not mean obligation, the ulama have still differed logically as to what it implies. They're saying that if there is a verb of command, raw verb of command in the Quran or in the Sunnah, in the logic of the language, and we don't have any other evidence, any other proof from that evidence, whether it is textually or otherwise, that tells us that this command from Allah or from Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam means nadb, recommendation, or means ibaha, for example, permission and lawfulness. If there is not such a qarina, they differ. One group of ulama, which is I think the majority of the ulama, say then it implies wujub, obligation. In the absence of qarina. We shall give examples later. In the absence of qarina. But if there is a qarina that tells me this verb of command is intended to convey the meaning of nadb or ibaha, that's what the answer is. I cannot say this implies obligation. I say the majority of the ulama say it implies wujub. That means other ulama, a minority of ulama of mujtahidun of old, such as in the Shafi'i school, and I think Imam Shafi'i himself, such as in the Shafi'i school, they say in the absence of qarina, or in the Maliki school, one of those, the absence of qarina to indicate otherwise tells us, in the absence of that qarina, that when there is a regular imperative command, it implies only nadb, guess, indeed. In the absence of qarina, I repeat, the absence of an indicating circumstance, textual or otherwise, that when I read the verb of command, that verb of command without that qarina implies only nadb. This is the minority of ulama, mujtahidun. And the majority says it implies wujub, obligation. And some ulama say it implies only ibaha. Now this is very, very beautiful, very important, very simple to understand if you read the logic behind this and how they argued logically from that point of view. It's just superb, wonderful. Each one of them, when you read, you say, they're right, they're right, they're right. But there are differences. One is right and one. In this, they cannot be all right. In other words, a mujtahid can be wrong. No doubt about it. That's why it's always safe to be with which type of mujtahids? The majority, to be safe. As a non-mujtahid, it's very safe to be with the majority. It's very, very safe. That doesn't mean that we may not follow a specific mujtahid. We don't know. We may. But it's always, if we know the opinion of the majority, it's always safer to do that way. And here, when we read the verb of command, Allah commanded, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam commanded, and then we treat, and this is not in the circles of non-mujtahids and non-ulama, where we have them argue as though an amr is always wajib. And that leads to even, these are not even scholarly differences, because amongst the scholars, these differences are acknowledged. These differences are acknowledged. And none of these differences amongst the ulama at the usuli level, whether the amr implies obligation or recommendation or ibaha in the absence of qarina, none of those differences lead to fisq or to kufr. They are legitimate, acceptable differences. They call them differences of diversity. اختلاف تنوعي. ليس اختلاف تضاد. It's not a confrontational type of difference. It's a type of difference that enriches diversity and solidifies unity as well. It will take a little long to elaborate on that, inshallah ta'ala, because they mention also examples in the Quran and in the Sunnah and in poetry of the old Arabs and in the logic of the language, and they argue that therefore we feel surer that it means either nadb or ibaha. And the others argue the other way, and they respond to each other. But at the usuli level, those differences exist. And for further elaboration, we need to have different, inshallah ta'ala, setups and special classes for that. But this is well established in all the works of the major works of Usool al-Fiqh. And that's part of what is taught it must be taught as well. I refer you to one of the modern simple books, but written well, called Usool-Fiqh by Sheikh Abdul Zaidan, rahimahullah ta'ala. That's written well and very clearly, but for a person who understands the Arabic language well, it's written in a beautiful, easy style to talk about these essential things. Usool al-Fiqh by Sheikh Abdul Zaidan. There are many other works. Of course, the works of old are these sources, but this summarizes the works of old and gives that to you and also addresses some of those issues. Usool al-Fiqh, like that. Abdul Zaidan. Abdul Zaidan. Dr. Abdul Zaidan. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, says in the Quran, وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا. He's speaking of the context of Hajj, for example. And he says, فَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ, when you are in a state of hil, not in a state of haram anymore, فَاصْطَادُوا, then hunt. So it's a verb of command. So does it become part of being in Hajj? Once you are in hil, we must go and hunt? It's a verb of command. It's an amr. But that amr, هذا الأمر بإجماع العلماء طبعا logically لا يفيد الوجوب ولا الاستحباب. Does not imply either obligation nor recommendation. It implies ibaha. It implies ibaha. In other words, now if you re-enter into a state of hil, you may hunt. In other words, it is permitted now to hunt land animals when you are not in a state of hil. فَاصْطَادُوا, this is a verb of command, فِعْلُ أَمْرٍ, in this case, which does not imply obligation nor recommendation. It implies ibaha. And so on. And there are many texts like that. Next thing is a nahi. Nahi, we said, is what? Negative imperative command. The negative imperative command. It is not prohibition. Now you know. Why it is not prohibition? Because again, the ulama have talked about what does nahi imply. And they have many possibilities in the logic of language. Many possibilities in the logic of language. In this case, some are metaphorical, some are real, haqiqi. Right? And then they are interested first in the haqiqi. The metaphorical, we only have recourse to it under certain conditions, as we shall mention later. So, in the haqiqi sense, they then have all agreed on two. Amr, there were three of them together. And therefore, in a specific case, in a specific ayah of the Quran or the Sunnah, when they read the verb of command, the question now to the scholar is, which one is intended by this verb of command? Obligation, recommendation, or ibaha, if it is not metaphorical? That's always the question to answer. Whereas in the mind of the uninitiated amongst us and the non-scholarly amongst us, even if you are highly educated in other things, command means you must. And that's not true. That's at the level of the awam. And the scholar answers the question whether it implies obligation or recommendation or ibaha, and he looks at certain things we shall learn more about inshallah ta'ala before he comes to such conclusions. Many things. Nahi, similarly, now they have to decide in the case of nahi whether it implies tahrim or karaha, because these are the two real haqiqi meanings that the tahrim conveys when it does not convey metaphorically other meanings. Are you with me? So, a nahi in the real intent in the real usage of the word nahi, is going to imply either one of the two. Tahrim or karaha. Now tahrim means what? Prohibition. Now tahrim means prohibition, haram, prohibited. And karaha means reprehension. Now thus it is reprehensible. What is makruh? Karaha, the noun from the adjective makruh. Makruh means, as we defined it, how is makruh defined? How is it defined? That's translation, not defined. You're not punished. Makruh is, if we don't do it, we are rewarded by Allah Azza wa Jal. If we don't do it, we're rewarded by Allah Azza wa Jal. And if we do it, out of Allah's mercy and rahmah and grace, we're not punished. That's makruh. Makruh means actually, in a sense, what? In a common sense, lawful. It's jaiz. Makruh is jaiz. Right? Jaiz, but with karaha. Makruh is jaiz, but with karaha. Mustahab is jaiz, but with istihbab, with an added thing to it. So makruh is reprehensible. It's jaiz, but with reprehension. Where does the reprehension lies? If we don't do it, we're rewarded and we'll miss that reward. And Allah Azza wa Jal doesn't like it for us. Yet out of His favor and mercy, He does not punish us. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's considered jaiz, legal. So that's karah, that's makruh. And then haram is, if we don't do it, we are rewarded. If we do it, we are punished. Now, when there is an imperative negative command in the language of the Quran or of the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, naha Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam an kadha. Even if the word used is naha, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam naha, articulated an imperative negative command towards something. Or if he says, don't do that, that's nahi. Don't do that. Don't eat that. Don't speak that way. Don't interact this way. Don't respond this way. Now that don't, for most of us, because we're used to secular activities and secular law, that implies don't. It's forbidden. That's why we translate don't and nahi as it's forbidden. And that's not always the case. Once there is a nahi in the Quran or in the Sunnah, what do the ulama do? The mujtahidun? What do? They have to find out whether that nahi implies prohibition or it implies reprehension, karaha. Now, and then the scholars, the jurists, the legal theoretical jurists, al-Usooliyun in the law, they have discussed the issue of amr. What does it imply in the absence of qarina? Same thing applies in the case of negative imperative command, in the case of nahi, in the absence of qarina, in the absence of any other external textual evidence or circumstantial external textual evidence or other than textual evidence. In the absence of that type of qarina which will tell us what exactly that nahi implies, either this or that, either prohibition or reprehension. In the absence of that qarina, what should the judgment of the scholar be in the absence of that qarina? So they have differed also, as they have differed in amr. One group and the majority say it implies tahrim, prohibition, in the absence of qarina. And the other group says it implies karaha only, reprehension. Therefore, part of the scholarly activity, of ijtihadi scholarly activity, when there is a negative command, is not only to do what we want, what we said, but to look, first of all, before he makes a judgment, this is haram or makruh, as many people do nowadays. Once there is a nahi, see, He says, don't, you must not. Even some people have ilm nowadays. Ilm has become levels. What does the mujtahid have to do? If you're following me carefully. How does he do that? Yes, that's what I've been mentioning already. I gave you already an answer to that. I just saw if somebody will see that. Huh? To be quiet. Jazakallahu khairan. May Allah help us be of those. But the scholar cannot do that. The mujtahid has to give an answer. We do that. Yes, we do that. What does the mujtahid scholar have to do to discern that this nahi is tahrim or karaha? Just, there you go. Part of what he has to do is to look if there is a qarina. If there is a qarina. To look and to research in accordance to the research instruments of the Shara, to research whether in the texts or outside of the texts there is a qarina, an external sort of evidence that indicates that this nahi implies karaha and not tahrim, for example. And that's exactly what they do. They always do that. The ulama, the mujtahidun, always do that. If it is not done, then that's no ilm, even if we have titles. Raise your hands before you speak and ask. He was before. With all due respect. Yes. No, don't give me examples. Understand the rules. Did you understand them? Do you have a question about these concepts? Did you understand everything here? An example later. I don't want to solve a problem now. I told you to solve a problem, to have a fatwa on an issue takes more than this. That's what we're learning, because previously there was something like that, and we said we don't answer those questions now. Because what we're learning now is not to give you an answer on a fiqh specific issue. We're learning how to use, how the ulama are using the processes to get to an answer. Now this is another process which we're using. Yes. Okay. The makruh being both jaiz and okay. Oh, now I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean. Yeah. أبغض الحلال إلى الله الطلاق. Though that hadith is debated among the scholars of hadith whether it is authentic or not. Yeah. Right. Assume that it is not a hadith. But we can also assume that it is a hadith for the sake of discussion. أبغض الحلال إلى الله الطلاق. The worst of halal to Allah is divorce. That could be a statement of early ulama and predecessors, rahimahumullah ta'ala. So yes, that's a way to combine this meaning to see karaha. It is halal, but despised. And therefore it is makruh and not haram. The makruh is halal. Halal meaning permitted, jaiz. If that's what you mean, yes, that, and it's an example that conveys what we mentioned and the ulama mentioned, that makruh is actually, jaiz, permissible, but not permissible in the sense of the technical definition of permissible, of halal. Because that technical definition is whether you do or you don't, you're neither punished nor rewarded. This is permissible but makruh. But makruh. We prefer that you don't do it. Mubah, there is no preference in the Shari'i sense. This or this are equal. Makruh, in the Shari'i sense, there is preference, you don't. Because if you don't, Allah will reward you. Okay? I'm sorry. Yes. You mean that it is or not حكم تكليفي? I'll come to that. I know what you're leading to. I'll come to that. Just be patient. I think I know what you're leading to. Yes. In what? Beautiful. That's, again, what we shall talk about of the reasons of respecting the differences amongst the ulama, as we shall come to see later. Sometimes they do differ in qarina. Sometimes, indeed, doing their best as logicians of law and of language, as beautiful hearts, many of them, as they were, rahimahullah ta'ala, and they still would differ as to the qarina. Indeed, that happens, and that has happened in both amr and nahi. Because also in amr, they have to look at the qarina to say it is wajib or mandub or mubah. Those who say the imperative positive command in the absence of qarina implies wujub, they still have to look if there is a qarina that would reduce obligation to nadb, to recommendation, or to ibaha. They do that, of course, and sometimes, indeed, there are differences, and you can see such differences are almost inescapable. They're very genuine differences, and yet they will come. One would say it's wajib, one would say it's mandub, mubah. One would say it's haram, one would say it's jais. Because one who says it's jais found the qarina, which the other one might have not seen. And levels of ilm are different. Even in the case of mujtahids, you have an A triple plus, and you have A plus, and you have A, and you have levels of ilm. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٌ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. So, let me briefly keep going here. So that's very important to keep in mind. And whether also the nahi, as we mentioned briefly before we had the recess for salah, whether the nahi implies butlan, fasad, or it implies sahha, validity or invalidity. If there is a nahi, don't do something, and we do it, is it in the shari'i sense valid after we did something we were prohibited to do, or was reprehensible to do? Did what we do constitute validity or invalidity? Invalid, right? The answer is no. The answer is that's not true. Again, whereas it can come to the mind of the uninitiated amongst us that nahi, negative imperative command, means if we do something it's invalid, that's not true always. It's not true always. Right? You're my dear brother, yes. Yeah. Is it surprising? It should be surprising. It was surprising to me a long time ago. It is surprising. Yeah. Something that the lawgiver says don't do, and in some cases I do it, and it is still valid. Remember, we mentioned an example before we had the break. Shouldn't be that surprised now. When we said, Naha Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam an salati fi al-thawb al-ma'sub. That Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Naha, he gave a negative imperative command against performing salah in a usurped garment. What if somebody usurps a garment, and in that garment he comes to salah? Is that salah? No, the usurping of the garment is haram. For sure. They don't differ on that issue. The question is, having come to salah with that thawb mahsub, because sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Naha ani salati fi thawb al-mahsub. That he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam spoke of through a negative imperative command against performing salah in such a garment. Does that also imply that the salah itself is invalid? That is batil. هل النهي يفيد البطلان أم لا يفيد البطلان أم يفيد الصحة? Does negative imperative command imply invalidity, or does it imply validity as well? That's the question. In some cases, they all agree. Well, actually, I don't think there is in any case in which they agree to that. In some cases, there is more or less agreement and differences about that question, depending on the nature of that negative command. As we mentioned, salah versus wearing something and salah are two different things. Wearing something is not part of the articles of salah, of the internal identity of salah, right? Because salah has what? Takbir, tilawa, qiyam, ruku', raf' min al-ruku', sujood. This is salah. Since there is nothing about this in that salah that is improper, and then he came about something outside of the identity of salah, and the person wearing something and performing that salah, and that wearing of that garment stolen is outside of the reality of salah, they said that salah is valid, but the person is going to be held accountable with Allah for committing haram. And therefore the question of nahi leads to the question of validity versus invalidity. Whereas some other ulama say it is both haram to do that and your salah is invalid, which is actually the minority of scholars on this issue. On this issue of النهي, هل النهي يفيد البطلان والفساد أم يفيد الصحة? And there are beautiful arguments on those issues, logical, rational, shari'i arguments as to which one it is and which one is more prevalent as an opinion. So even there is room for analysis. And that not because some of us jump, nay, therefore don't, invalid. And that's, yes, the way the lay argue when the lay of us want to mingle with the affairs of the mujtahidun, rahimahumullah ta'ala. And we will make serious flaws and terrible mistakes that with time would lead to horrible discord, to horrible dispute, to even, wal'iyadhu billah, killings and murders in the name of the truth, which has nothing to do in reality with the truth. Because if we're unequipped to practice medicine and we go try to save a life by having not been equipped properly to practice medicine, and the person dies, we are held accountable both in Sharia and in secular law. Is that clear? Do we all accept that? And so it is in matters of Sharia. If we're not equipped with the instruments of the logic of the Sharia, the rationale of the Sharia, of the adillah, of wujuh al-istidlal bil-adillah fi Sharia and so on, if we're not equipped with that, and we venture to say this is halal and this is haram and this is bid'ah and this is sunnah and this is kada and this is kafir and this is muwahhid and this is fasiq and this is mushrik and this is kada, and we're not mujtahid and we do not have the instruments as must be had, then we are held to account on the day of judgment as criminals, wal-iyadhu billah. So that's another reason for us to see why some ulama would differ. They would differ, for example, at this level, as some of you observed correctly, that they would differ in the qarina itself. The qarina, they would differ. And perhaps we'll have examples and I will mention that to you, inshallah ta'ala, some of those examples. There is a qarina in which they differed that led to different hukm. And therefore one would say it is haram, one would say it is makruh. One would say it is wajib, one would say it is mandub. That occurs, not often, but it does occur. Genuine, honest differences, because the logic they have been using has to do with these axioms and these theorems that are the foundations of the law. Usool ul-Fiqh is sort of a grammar of the law. The grammar of the law. If you don't know grammar of English, you will speak jargon. You speak street language and make a lot of mistakes in accordance to the rules of classical English. You will. But if you know the grammar well, you will not make most likely those mistakes, or least of those mistakes. Similarly, with the shara, with the law. If you don't know the grammar of the law, the usool of the fiqh, we can opine jargon. Street fiqh. That's what it is. Sometimes you may hit it right. Sometimes you may hit it right. But many times or often, because it's the law, it's not just language, we'll hit it very wrong. And being wrong in speaking English is not like being wrong in a statement of law. Because that could have rights of others that are removed or given. Lives that are given or lost. Property that is given or lost. Peace that is supported or lost. And so on. It's much more dangerous to not have the grammar of the law than not to have the grammar of the language, English or Arabic. Amen. Is there a question up to this point? Yes. The relationship is that, because I put them there, because they both come from the question of nahi, from the question of imperative negative command. When there is an imperative negative command, we have 4 questions. Does it imply haram? Does it imply makruh? Does it imply sahih? Does it imply batil? Not necessarily, but it's good. It's good to think that way. Not necessarily, which means sometimes yes. Not necessarily. When they characterize something as outside of, for example, salah as example, there is something that is outside of salah which is linked to salah. Like correct. Like wudu, right. So also for libas, I don't know if from the conditions of salah is to such an awra. Correct. Correct. But that's not part of salah. Yeah, that's part of the arkan of salah versus the shurut of salah versus the sunan of salah versus the wajibat of salah. All of those are classified in accordance to these categories. For example, shart of salah versus a wajib of salah versus a rukn of salah. What is the difference? What's the difference between rukn of salah? Let's take one by one. What's the difference between the rukn of salah and shart of salah? Can't hear you. When I say what is the difference, don't give me a translation. Because the translation, I'm going to ask you, what does it mean? Same thing. It's just, I'm giving you the terms in Arabic because we all should know them. What it means doesn't mean, say it in English. It means what it means in the juristic sense, in the fiqh sense as we're talking about. Yes. I'm sorry? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, that's true. That's one difference. But in the definition of shart, that doesn't help us. No, just to make it, I don't think you have the answer unless you have studied it well. Yes. Thank you. But that's only a translation. So the definition is this. The difference between shart and rukn, first of all, and shart and wajib is like this. Shart A is shart for B. Let's say shart A is shart for B. If and only if the following happens. In the absence of A, there is no B. For B to exist, there must be A. And A is external to the reality of B. A is a rukn for B, the same thing except condition 2. Rukn is rukn if A is internal to the reality of B. And they are both obligatory for B. So every shart, every rukn is obligatory, is wajib. But not every wajib is shart or rukn. First of all, are you following me? Shart is shart because it's obligatory for something else. If shart does not exist, that something else does not exist in the Shari'i sense. And number two, it is external to its reality. Whereas rukn is internal to its reality. Example of that, pick one. Pick a shart, any shart. Khalas, we take that. Wudu for salah. Wudu is a prerequisite, is a shart for salah. If there is no wudu, go ahead and do salah. That salah doesn't exist in the Shari'i sense. لا تترتب عنه آثاره الشرعية البتة. Legally, in the Shari'i sense, it means nothing, that salah. As though it doesn't exist. Though it exists physically, it doesn't exist hukman. It doesn't exist fiqh-wise, juristically. Right? And wudu is external to the identity of salah. The identity of salah begins where? Allahu Akbar, takbiratul ihram, and what's in it. Khalas? Rukn is like shart. If there is no rukn, there is no salah, but is internal to salah. An example, ruku', sujood, takbiratul ihram by itself, in accordance with the majority of the ulama except the Hanafi, al-Fatiha is rukn. You see the difference between shart and rukn. Both of them are wajib, but they're not. Wajib is not shart, and there is some wajib that is neither shart or rukn. طهارة البدن أو الثوب من النجاسة. The fact that the body or the clothing must be clean from najasa. In accordance with the majority of the ulama, and many ulama, this is neither shart, of course no rukn, it is wajib, or in accordance with some ulama at least, it is wajib. In other words, if you prayed inadvertently in najasa, and you realize that, your salah is not invalid. If it were a shart, then all that which you prayed during the state of najasa is invalid. And those who argue that way, they said that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam once was in salah, famous example, was in salah, and after a while, he removed his sandals and put them away. And those who were behind him, by the way, listen to what happened. The Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, look at this beautiful ta'assi by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They all removed their shoes, their sandals. They did just like he does. No question asked. No question asked. So what he's doing, I know better. That's what some of us do to ulama and to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, astaghfirullah, without even realizing it. They removed all their sandals. At the end, he told them, why did you do that? He said, Ya Rasulullah, because you did. Subhanallah. And he said, no, I did that because Jibreel came and told me and informed me that there was some najasa in my sandals. And I removed that. And the ulama say, since he continued his salah and did not interrupt it and did not start again, that salah was all valid. And therefore, if najasa in the clothing were shart, the previous would be also invalid. So they say it is wajib. So you see example, wajib, but not shart and not rukn. And shart and rukn are both wajib. But wajib is not necessarily shart or rukn. Very briefly here, and I will stop for the recess. As a fard and wajib, we said we distinguish, the ulama distinguish between al-fard and wajib at the level of which school? Hanafi school. They distinguish between wajib and fard, and we explained why, right? You didn't forget that. You didn't forget that. And that the majority of the ulama do not distinguish between wajib and fard. But there are different nuances there. There are very specific, important issues there. They also, in the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, they have another detail. They distinguish in the makruh between two types of makruh. Between two types of makruh. And some of you know that, which is what? Right. Tanzihi and tahrimi. Karahatu tanzih versus karahatu tahrim. And what is the difference? Same concept as between wajib and fard. Same concept as between wajib and fard. If the nahi, if the imperative command towards something is generated from a text that is conclusive and qat'i, then that it is haram. Number one, nahi. Now, if the karaha is born out of a text that is dhanni, if the karaha now, I'm sorry, forget about the tahrim. If the karaha now is born out of a text that is from the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and not from ijtihad, then that karaha is karahat tahrim. Karahat tahrim. If the text implies karaha, and that karaha is from a text that is, let's say, sunnah to ahad from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that's makruh karahata, that's makruh karahata tanzih. That's makruh karahata tanzih. And that is the called makruh, just makruh in accordance to the other ulama. When they say makruh, in the Hanafi terminology, it's makruh karahata tanzih. When the jumhur of the ulama say it is haram, born out of ijtihad or a text that is non-mutawatir, the ulama of the Hanafi jurisprudence call it makruh karahat tahrim, which is equivalent to another form of haram in the Jumhuri opinion. Is this clear? No. It is either makruh karahat tanzih, which is the makruh in accordance to the Shafi'is and the Malikis and the Hanbalis, or makruh karahat tahrim, which is the haram in accordance with the Jumhur, but not from a mutawatir text. Okay? That's the nuance. Makruhun karahat tanzih or makruhun karahat tahrim. So if you read fiqh and you read in, let's say, Hanafi fiqh, be careful. When they say makruh, what do they mean? Do they mean karahat makruh tanzihan or makruh tahriman? When you read a Shafi'i or a Maliki jurist saying it is makruh, and you're Hanafi, which makruh does he mean? You know, don't jump to conclusions. Don't jump to conclusions. You have to find out, and you will not find out if you're not at least a serious student of ilm who will go and investigate the usool of this issue. And if you don't do that, you will not know the answer, and you will hurt yourself, and you will hurt others by telling them what is wrong, perhaps. And yet each one of those definitions has a specific scope in which it is applied. So makruh, in accordance, I repeat, to the majority of the ulama, is reprehensible whether the dalil is qat'i or dhanni. In the jurisprudence of the Ahnaf, it is two kinds. Makruh tanzihan or makruh tahriman. And there are, of course, two different levels of karaha. I'm going to stop here, inshallah ta'ala, for our recess, and we resume in at most how long? 7 minutes. 7 minutes جوازا. 5 minutes استحبابا. More than 7 minutes مكروه. تنزيها. Now that's it. مكروه كراهة تنزيه. Excuse me, please. I need a break.